We're doing this, by the way, for our grandchildren, aren't we? You know, we're doing this for our grandchildren. Dr. Jill Malone and Dr. Lynn Finn. All right. We're going to ask each of you, this is like a television show where there's not a lot of time, but we're going to get some straight answers. And the straight answer I want to hear from each of you, by the way, Dr. Lynn Finn right here is an infectious disease. She says, don't ever talk about me. Well, you're up here. That's the problem. The problem with each one of these people is that you only heard like a little bit of their brain power today. You know, I wish we had the time to take the entire brain out and hear what they have to say, right? You guys have been so amazing. Jill Malone, a scientist and a wonderful woman who's been there and if you follow Dr. Malone's Substacks, she and Robert together do an amazing job of being able to pick out the issues of the day like nobody else. So Dr. Jill Malone, thank you for coming up with us. All right, so here's my question to you, and this is not coming from me personally, this is coming from my patients who are wondering, because you've all heard about the COVID virus. And a couple of you alluded to the fact that there were different variants, different vials, I should say, of the vaccine. Let's get to the vaccine that did more harm, all right? So we got vaccines that did more harm than others, and we have viruses that have been doing more harm than others. So let's think about both of those. Patients are coming to my office saying, do I need to worry now about coronavirus? Do I need to test? Do I need to do anything different? Let's get that out of the way, and then we'll hit the vaccines. Does anyone here want to handle that question? Do our patients, let me start with Dr. Finn and then go from there.
We do not need to test. We need to show up with our symptomatology and treat it as we would any single-stranded RNA type viral infection. There's no need to test. There's no need to quarantine. There's no need to contact trace. Treat yourself. Keep your vitamin D3 levels high. Treat yourself with zinc if you're symptomatic, and get over it. You're fine.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Dr. Malone.
First one has to be able to make the microphone work. I want to this is a gift to those of you that are still in environments where you're being forced to take this medical product to preserve your job, okay? The data are clear that these medical products do not prevent infection, replication, or spread. That's unequivocal. The government agrees to that. The data vary depending on variant. That these products even the older products are between 60% and 0% effective in preventing infection and spread of the virus, which is the whole justification for vaccine mandates. In contrast, studies from the NIH published in 2021 have demonstrated that testing 3 times a week can result in over 98% positive predictive value. In other words, sensitivity for detection of infection. So if your employer is placing you in a position for whatever reason or your university or your medical school of inserting that it's necessary for you to take this product to reduce or eliminate risk to your coworkers or patients, that is a false narrative. These vaccine products, quote unquote, cannot do that. And if you're forced into that position, it is a documented fallback option for you to say to your employer or your medical school, actually, the data clearly demonstrate that if you allow me to test 3 times a week, it'll be far more effective in preventing infection of others than if you force me to take this vaccine. So I think that's the one last limited hangout for testing, is if those of you that are being subjected to these policies can fall back on that study, which I published in the links in our Substack for you, and the expert witness testimony that I prepared for this. You can fall back and show the documentation to your employer or medical school that if they're going to force you into this position, it's actually better policy if they have you tested 3 times a week. And I think that is the only rationale that I can find right now for the use of these tests. Over.
Okay, that's what. Over. That takes us back to our Zoom days, right? Robert was the first to introduce over and out, right? This is a good fodder for discussion, isn't it? You do have people who are still being required. Later this afternoon, we're going to have several people up here who have been victimized by these draconian vaccine mandates in medical schools, even to get into even high schoolers trying to become EMTs. It's incredible what's out there. But this said, what you just put out there, Robert, I think is a little bit, maybe a little bit something that we could disagree with. The testing. It's the testing that has been mandated, and this happened actually in Florida for a while. They said, well, if I'm not going to get a vaccine as a doctor to work in the hospital, then I have to submit myself to weekly testing with no swabs and or wear a mask. What do you all have any thoughts about that at this point?
Well, I'm not advocating for this. I'm saying as a defensive legal position, if you're put into a box of leave medical school, which happens all the time, or take the jab, a logical legal response you can provide is that in fact the jab doesn't work, it won't protect from infection, it won't protect from spread. And if that's your true objective, if you, Mr. Dean, are acting with integrity, here are the data showing that repeat testing is actually much more effective than these products. That's all I'm saying. I'm not advocating for this. I'm saying this is a legal defense that you can use.
It's a last-ditch effort. Well, let's get back to the testing and just see, what do you all think about testing for COVID? Lynn, you just mentioned it. Stop testing for COVID in general, because remember, this is a scientific panel. Even though they may request that or require it, we know it's not good science, right? Is anyone else going to agree with me to be testing at this point for COVID?
At this point, don't get tested. I mean, the variants, like I already showed, are going to continue to change the testing in the laboratory setting, and I ran a lab for over 2 decades. The testing isn't going to keep up with the variants. And so COVID for most is a common cold now, unless people have been multiply injected and their immune system suppressed, then they can get more severe disease because of that. But don't test. Don't test. As a laboratory director, don't test.
And let me throw this out there. As a laboratory person, and all of you are going to want to chime in on this, Dr. Hatfield including, what I saw in clinical practice during COVID, and many of you saw this happen with you, your kids, or your grandkids, is they go to the emergency room and the swab's up the nose for COVID, but they started testing for other things as well, as they often will. And one of the things that came back, oh my gosh, your baby, your child, your 10-year-old, you're 60 years old, have RSV. Now, RSV now, if all of you have been following, is the newest vaccine to come out. So I think this is the time with this vaccine group to talk about it right now, because I don't have it on the agenda later. What do you all have to say about the emergence of this universal policy to vaccinate everyone against RSV in light of the testing that was done for COVID? Richard?
I'll talk about that. The RSV, I mean, at the end of the day, we're looking at, we do testing because we want to find a reason to treat or not treat. So in general, this is a risk reward, and basically we don't test asymptomatic people. Asymptomatic people don't transmit diseases. That's been shown over and over again. So I think it comes down to testing asymptomatic people is ridiculous. So I think in symptomatic people, sometimes it helps. It's nice to know. They have these 30-panel PCRs. It's kind of nice to know what you're faced against. So I do have some thoughts that sometimes testing helps. You got sick people, it can be helpful to know what's coming around, because there may be some differences in what you want to do for treatment depending on what shows up. So I think if people are sick, there's some rationale. And I think in general, to go back to the vaccine, I want to say this: it's bad medicine. It's not. There's no risk reward in any age group. Do not take the vaccine. It's harmful. There's an uptick in cancer. There's an uptick in sudden deaths, and there's lots of reasons not to take it. So I think the data is clear. It actually doesn't stop infection, doesn't stop transmission. In fact, the more you take it, the more likely you are to fall sick. So as far as testing goes in RSV, I think in general, very few patients. I don't know if I know of a single patient that's ever died of RSV that's an adult. And right now they're saying that if you're over 60, you should have this vaccine. I recently had a patient came in last week, and I said, hey, I would stay away from these COVID vaccines. And he said, well, I just got back. I took diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, RSV, COVID, pneumovax, flu vaccine, and I'm going back next week for the Shingrix. I was like, oh my God, I left the room quickly.
Yeah,
No,
there
I
you go.
didn't.
There you go. So, Richard, I'm glad he brought that up, all the people getting vaxxed. I want to give you my take-home message is you don't need the RSV vaccine. We're going to have pediatricians up there later. But please, RSV is a benign, self-limited respiratory infection. Please, Joe.
Is it?
It's on.
Okay, it's on. So I just want to change that a little bit. So Jeremy Farrar of the WHO came out with a PR piece last week about dengue and how it's soon going to rip through the southern hemisphere of the United States, all because of global change. And this also happens to coincide with a relatively newly licensed vaccine for dengue. And so as a signal response, since we're here in Florida, that this is kind of the upcoming thing that I think we have to be very wary about, is this another propaganda piece to try and get everybody vaccinated down here, you know, from global change from dengue, which most dengue is asymptomatic, and it's really not a risk until you've had it more than once, and there's a lot of complexity in that. But basically, this is going to be the new push coming on, I believe.
Thank you for bringing that up. Dengue fever, you know, my goodness, I've seen it once in my 34-year career, and that was when I was in the Army. So, no, you do get people here from tropical countries. I'm going to have Dr. Hadfield make a comment. While that, if they could line up my one slide before we're going to finish. I had one slide, it says ABFM. It's the American Board of Family Medicine's criticism of one of these guys. I wanted to make sure we get that projected. So if you can line that up, it's like my third slide. Steve, Dr. Steve, you had a question?
Yeah, what we've seen over the last 3 years was a natural progression of the virus. Not one thing the White House task force on COVID-19 did was effective. Not one. In fact, it drug it out 2 more years than it should have been. Viruses are subject to a biological process called Mueller's ratchet. You can Google it. It's a good explanation on Google. But every time it replicates, it's making mistakes until it gets to the point where a lot of the viral particles aren't viable. They can't reproduce. And the ones that do reproduce are so burdened with mutations, whether good or not good or immaterial, the virus loses fitness. It loses hybrid vigor. It's inbred too much. And this is what the virus has become.
And can we ask another question? And I want you to answer this while you get that response, because I want you to talk to everyone, all of you, about what we've heard recently. And actually, one of my patients came in last week and said, Dr. Tell, I looked up which batch I took, which Moderna vaccine I had. And I'll give you, I had my daughter, who you'll meet later on, is a physician with me. She's in the Kissimmee office. One of our long-term patients, 50-year-old gentleman who had a normal colonoscopy, I don't know if he was quite 50, 5 years ago, doubly vaxxed, doubly boosted, metastatic colon cancer now. We can go on and on about the cancers, but before, I want to know if you can, your state, whatever comment you want to make now, and then comment on these batches, how critical it is that people know what was put into their arms.
Hello. I just wanted to comment also on what Dr. Hadfield was saying. With that in mind, in 2020, I kind of mirrored what Kurt Witowski said, which is basically virus is going to virus, so protect the vulnerable, let it cycle through the healthy population. It will burn out because of these mistakes, these replication mistakes. This was the proper way to handle it, much like SARS-1 that burned out, correct? What is the difference between how we handled SARS-1 versus SARS-2? We blocked early treatment. We had very dangerous hospital protocols with EMA drugs, EUA drugs, and we rolled out a vaccine to the entire population that is actually a genetic therapy to produce a foreign protein in our bodies. What is that going to do? It's going to force mutation, force immune evasion, and also suppress the immune system of those vaccinated, which is why we're seeing an increase in RSV and all of these other things, because you have now a suppressed population that is subject to all of these regular viral infections that go around. So getting to what you were asking about...
The batches.
So I read the original CMC, which is the entire manufacturing Bible of a drug or a therapy. And when I read it with my husband, who's a biochemist, we both looked at it and said, there's no way this will pass. The QC is horrible. The replication's horrible. There's no GMP, which is good manufacturing practices, at play here. It's garbage. There's no way. Don't worry about it. Well, it did come through, right? So in that, there were so many manufacturing facilities to pump it out for the whole world. There's going to be differences because there were not precise tech transfers to each of these manufacturing facilities. The original manufacturing for this vaccine was changed. What you know that is Comirnaty, that is approved, that was never distributed in the United States, has a different manufacturing process than what is being rolled out. And it's from different manufacturing facilities. So you're going to have variation. So those lot variations, some may have more DNA plasmid contamination, some may have less, some may have completely destroyed LMPs. Remember the minus 80-degree freeze that it had to undergo? But then you would go through these vaccine tents, drive-thrus, and they had these vials sitting out in the heat all day, and they're sitting there distributing it to everyone. There was no continuity between manufacturing or handling of these therapies. So you're going to have different batches, do different things.
Thank you, Lynn. Maybe Brian and then Dr. Malone, and then we'll have that slide.
Yeah, real quick, howbadismybatch.com is a good website to track the batches. And
say that again.
Howbadismybatch.com. And there's a great paper that came out of Denmark from Schmeling and colleagues, and they looked at about a third of individuals that got shots had not even a sore arm. This is the good news. About 2/3 had, a moderate reaction. It was only about 4 or 5% that had severe reactions. So, like Dr. Finn just said, there are a lot of people that dodged a bullet because of maybe batches that ended up being duds, basically. So that's the silver lining in all of this, is not, all these scary things we're talking about. Be optimistic. If you're doing okay, continue to optimize your health.
Thank you. And then Robert.
The unfortunate truth is that the FDA, Health Canada, European Medicines Agency are stonewalling on this issue of lot-to-lot variability. Ryan has mentioned how bad is my batch. So, for instance, the second shot that I took is in one of the known bad batches. These data have been accumulated by just linking the VAERS database reports with batch numbers. The database reports of adverse events, something which the CDC and the FDA steadfastly refuse to do. The Paul Ehrlich Institute, which is the entity responsible for drug testing in the European Union system, European Medicines Agency, has reported that they've identified multiple samples, lot release samples, from different batches that seem to be devoid of content. They don't even have the material in them. Pfizer and Moderna have insisted through contracts that governments not be allowed to perform the normal process of batch release testing. So we're in a position where the pharmaceutical industry has leveraged this technology to force governments to bypass their normal rules in assessing the purity, adulteration, contamination contents of lots in the way that they have done for decades in order to be allowed to purchase these products and distribute them to their populations. This is clear corruption. And that's why we're in this situation where we clearly have, as John is pointing out, major batch-to-batch lot variations. This appears, as he mentioned, to map to differences in toxicity. Recently, some of the groups that have been identifying the contamination or adulteration, I assert, of these batches with high levels of DNA fragments have identified what they believe to be some correlation between enhanced toxicity in some of these batches and the presence of these DNA contaminants at higher levels. And so the story is still developing. We don't have all the data yet because it's being actively hidden from us, obscured, and we are being stonewalled. But we're getting closer and closer, and people like Dr. Finn and others who are doing this batch release testing that the government refuses to do are starting to be able to hold them accountable and document what has actually happened.
What I'm going to do for the last question, thank you, Dr. Malone. Oh my gosh, we want to be here all morning. We still have more time at the end of the day, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to do the slide. I want to ask a question that probably everyone in this room needs to know the answer, because I do, and that is I got a call yesterday from a state legislature, one of our heroes, Dr. Joel Rudman, up in Tallahassee, who wanted to be with us. Dr. Joel Rudman, he's the only physician in Tallahassee in the state legislature. Very frustrating that we only have one physician. But he called me. He had to get the shots. He got the shots to go do whatever. And I think it was 2 Pfizers. And now he is, a year and a half later, he's very active. He kayaks, he runs, he does all sorts of stuff. He just was diagnosed with a large thromboembolus, a huge blood clot from his waist down to his ankle. And he is devastated by that, as would I. I'm a very active person, as would anyone in this room. And he's asking the question, did the spike protein from those vaccines do something to me 2 years ago that could still harm me today? This is the pathophysiology group. We're going to have the clinical group later and talk about what to do clinically. But what about pathophysiologically speaking, etiologically speaking? Can you be harmed 2 years later from having received the vaccine?
The evidence is pointing to yes, because DNA can persist. So with contamination and the cells taking this up, they may be making truncated, shortened proteins. They may be making a full spike protein. Why 6 months later can we prove in the laboratory in Italy that the vaccinal spike is still there 6 months later? And that's when they stopped the study. They didn't carry that out to 1 or 2 years. But the more you get injected, the more spike you're making. There is no regulatory factory in the body or no proof as to when the production of this spike stops.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. Keep
so
going.
it's a big question. What I would say is a couple of things. One, we're seeing increase in deaths and sudden deaths in that age group that took the vaccine. Like I said, a 40% increase in deaths. We're seeing that when you check on PET scan, every single person who took the vaccine had some evidence of inflammation in the myocardium. So these patients, maybe there's not a spike protein problem, but maybe there's potentially a scarring issue that may lead to sudden death at some point in the next 2 years. And then we're seeing that this product can get into the DNA and cause problems with the DNA damage repair. And we're definitely seeing, and if you look at the data, an uptick in cancers, and this is 2 years down the line, we're seeing an increase in cancers. The other thing is we're seeing a huge increase in viral immune surveillance issues. So we're seeing a doubling of problems with shingles and Epstein-Barr, Bell's palsy, things like this. In my own clinic with 300,000 patients, we saw a doubling of both of those in the last 2 years. So we're seeing things that are coming on further on down the line because we don't know exactly what the causes for each one of those are, but it is definitely affecting later on the innate and the immune response and the adaptive immune response. So it's to be continued is what I would say. To be
very
continued.
Good, very good. So what I'm hearing is that the onslaught of the spike proteins devastated our body's normal immune system. That to me makes all the sense in the world, especially when you're attacking our children, which we'll discuss. A couple more comments, and then we're going to close. Dr. Malone, and then Jill, and then Lynn. Thank you.
I just wanted to say a very simple thing. These products do not deliver messenger RNA to your body. By the FDA's own language, this is a modified messenger RNA. It incorporates a synthetic molecule, a methylated pseudouridine, which looks more like one of the components of DNA, thymidine, than it does to uridine, the normal component of RNA. This is associated with, so this is a chemically modified unnatural substance that's put all through the RNA, this methylated pseudouridine. And it causes the RNA to have two key features. One is a very, very long half-life. How long does it persist in your body? That's not known. Hasn't really been rigorously tested. Number two, it is there to suppress inflammation. That's the whole reason to use pseudouridine, is to suppress in a nonspecific way inflammatory responses which happen to compromise the delivery of truly natural RNA to some extent. So it's there, and it's unnatural. The FDA calls it a modified messenger RNA. We don't know how long it lives, and we do know that it's immunosuppressive. Those are established facts. Over.
Thank you, Thank you, Dr. Robert. Dr. Jill?
Yeah, so I just want to change the subject briefly. And that is, in this room, we have a lot of physicians, healthcare workers, and activists. This is a transition year. We have a lot of presidential candidates, and we're not hearing anybody talk about reforming HHS, the FDA, CDC, and NIH. Okay? We need to get out there, and we need to change the dialogue in this presidential campaign. We need to be hearing reforms, how they're going to reform, and we need to hear it soon, and we all have a job to do, and that is pushing these candidates to come up with a plan to reform HHS.
Thank you, Dr. Jill. Yeah, agreed.
And on the heels of that, I wanted to deliver a little bit of good news, because hopefully this will set a precedent for all of the states. But today it was signed into law in the state of Texas, SB 7. It was authored by Senator Bob Hall and Senator Middleton, and it states plainly that no entity is allowed to mandate the COVID-19 vaccine in any form in any worker, employee of any kind, any student, any medical student, public or private, unless they will be fined a $50,000 fine per person per offense. That was signed into law today. Hopefully it will move over to Florida.
Thank you very much. And Robert?
And what Lynn, in her modesty, typical, is not telling you is that she played a central role in driving this thing forward together with people like Bob Hall. And Richard Arso also was central to this.
Thank you. Yes. And I'll tell you what, this has been an amazing start to the day. I want to thank all of our scientists and doctors up here. We're going to move into another special tribute right now as you all, thanks again, to give them a big hand, this group. Amazing. Yeah, you can leave those there. Sure. Try one.